Okay, why don't we move on to God's omniscience? He's being all-knowing. Before we kind of get into the weeds of this, I want to kind of throw a couple of questions/objections at you. A question I get very often, I think a lot of people have is, okay, so if God knows all future events with certainty, then he knows whether or not I am going to be saved or go to hell. And if he can't be wrong about the knowledge he now has, then my fate is sealed. So shouldn't this just lead to fatalism if I don't really have a choice?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And it's one that, we mentioned before. I work for the Thomistic Institute. We have this program called Aquinas 101, and people sign up and you get emails with vids, and people will often send questions. We have like a little Ask a Friar feature, and they send questions to ask about, like, what's the deal with this or what's the deal with that? And a lot of people have asked this question. So a lot of people are asking this question, are disturbed by this question, want an answer to this question. So the answer that I'm going to give is not wholly satisfactory. So it's not going to be like, all right, let me just listen in right now real closely, because at the end of the next 3.5 minutes, I'll be entirely satisfied and feeling 100% worshipful. It's not going to be wholly satisfactory, but it'll give you some principles to think about it. All right. So St. Thomas says that God causes necessary things to happen necessarily, and contingent things, we could say free things, to happen freely. So God is so powerful, God's causality is so rich, that not only does he cause the thing to be, but he causes it to act, and causes it to act in the way proper to what it is. Mm-hmm. So, rocks fall to the surface of the earth by a kind of gravity. There's no real choosing in that. Plants turn their leaves towards the sun and photosynthesize by a kind of natural disposition. There's no real thinking to that. Animals, they flee from their predators by a kind of instinct. There's like an animal thought to that, but it's something that's basically at work in their members, irrespective of whether or not they choose to do so. But in our case, we are uniquely capable among material creation of understanding what our end is and choosing whether or not we pursue it. So we can know our end as an end, and we can pursue our end as an end. And the whole dignity and grandeur of being a human person is that we are free. And when we talk about freedom, oftentimes we think about it as a capacity to opt for different things. You got the A option, you got the B option, you got the C option. Like, I could choose to become a saint. I could, settle for being a Wall Street broker, or I could, do crack cocaine. You're like, these are very tempting options. And you think that you're free to the extent that you have these options. But the way that freedom is classically conceived is a power for the good, and that one becomes more and more free to the extent that he actualizes this power to be fixed in the good. So that person is most free who beholds the face of God in heaven. He does not have other options, and yet he is fully alive and fully engaged in the very thing for which he was made. So God gives us the dignity and grandeur of being able to know our end as an end and to choose it as an end. And when he makes us to be and makes us to act, he makes us to act in precisely this way. So though he may know how all of our decisions will play out, we do not. And we are free to choose for the good that lies in store. And what is more, God is giving us grace so that we would respond generously to that call and vocation. So there's like a 20th century Dominican who says that at every moment of every day, God is giving to even the most hardened sinner at least the grace sufficient to pray. So God is always prompting, he's always goading. And if we go to heaven, it's by God's predestinating grace. If we go to hell, it's by our choice. So you are free in the sense that you are empowered for the good. God is supplying you with what you need to choose the good, but he is supplying you in such a way that it actually be your choice. Mm-hmm. So just because it is known to God does not mean that it is fated for us, because he makes us to act as human beings.
How does this differ from Molinism, and why, presumably, do you reject Molinism?
Right. So in the Molinist understanding, you have this kind of middle knowledge. So it's not,
I'm springing these sort of sophisticated theological systems upon you without warning.
No, it's great. I love it. Let's go. So in Molinism, there's it's common to talk about God's knowledge in two main ways, and then Molinists add a third way of talking about God's knowledge, which they call middle knowledge. So before the prior and the posterior. And in middle knowledge, basically, God has insight into how you will respond if he offers you grace, and then he judges whether or not to give you grace based on how you will respond. So the problem with this is that God ends up being passive or receptive. So it ends up being the human being who initiates the life of grace, because God is making the judgment based on how generously you will respond, whether or not you will consent and cooperate. And so it's like, all right, there's some native excellence here, to which God is then responding in his choice as to whether or not he will give the grace. But this is to do violence to God's initiation in the act and in the giving of grace. And a lot of Dominicans would argue that this type of thinking has been, it's been corrected by some early church councils, like Second Orange, for instance. Right? So we do not give ourselves the beginning of faith, nor do we give ourselves the beginning of grace. Rather, we rely upon God to do that. Now, mind you, when you consent and cooperate with some graces, then you can kind of expect that further graces will be given, but your consent and cooperation does not force God's hand, right? So God is not responding to us or reacting to us. God is, sovereign in charge. He's giving generously. So the kind of classic Augustinian or Thomistic position tries to hold off that notion and kind of claim the initiation or claim the instigation for God.
Good. Okay. Fair enough.
Righteous.
Thanks. Well done. Okay. Here's another question. Well, let me quote Dawkins from The God Delusion.
Let's do it.
In page 101, at least in my book, he says this. And here he's basically making an argument for atheism based on the incoherence of the concept of God, right? He says, incidentally, it has not escaped the notice of logicians that omniscience and omnipotence are mutually incompatible. If God is omniscient, he must already know how he is going to intervene to change the course of history using his omnipotence. But that means he can't change his mind about his intervention, which means he is not omnipotent.
Boom.
What say you?
Yep. Dawkins, just a slim thug G. What would I say? Okay. So is changing one's mind a perfection? That's the question.
Right.
Because when we talk about God being omnipotent and we're talking about him being omniscient, the more fundamental category is perfection. Is God perfect? And the answer is yes. He lacks nothing proper to his nature. He exhausts all that there is of being. And so, for him to change his mind is a kind of incoherent notion, because to what would he change it, or from what would he change it? Was he like, I conceived of this thing here, but turns out I was wrong, and so now I'm going to get better. Okay, then he wasn't God to begin with, as we understand him in the classic tradition. Or he could be like, you know what? I was holding to these high ideals, but now I can see that these guys really just aren't up to the task. So I will accommodate myself and just have worse ideas. So that way they can think that we're all kind of thrown in together in this general muck and mire of deficient existence. No, that's insane. He would cease to be God. So when we're talking about God, we're talking about him in terms of perfection. So the changing of one's mind is not a perfection. To have a vacillating or mercurial nature is a weakness, right? Or it's something proper to what it means to be us. So we are the type of beings that we learn, we grow, we progress, and that's part of what it means for us to mature and to become holy ourselves. But that's baked in because, you're born with a blank slate and you grow in a human culture, and then you acquire certain virtuous perfections, and then you hope for the best, unto ages of ages. But God is not the way that we are, right? So I think it's to anthropomorphize, again, to ask of God peculiarly human perfections which have some limitation baked in, because God is not limited in the way that we are limited. So we should not expect of him to be limited and therefore deem him imperfect because he does not have the limitations which we associate with our human experience.
Thank you for watching this clip. You can click here to watch the full episode. And I want to say a big thanks to our sponsors and to our amazing patrons for making all of this possible. Please do us a favor before you go. Click that subscribe button and then the bell. And that way YouTube will be forced to let you know every time we put out a new episode.